The engine of your Zero fighter screams as you dive toward the American destroyer at 300 miles per hour. Your hands shake on the controls, not from fear, but from the drugs they gave you before takeoff to calm your nerves and dull the terror of what you're about to do. You are 20 years old. Yesterday you wrote your final letter home telling your mother you died honorably for the Emperor. This morning you drank ceremonial sake and received a 1,000-stitch belt sewn by patriotic women. Around your head you wear a hachimaki headband painted with the rising sun. In 30 seconds, you will be dead. But this isn't the glorious, heroic death that propaganda promised. This is a calculated suicide mission born from Japan's desperation as American forces close in on the home islands. You're not a warrior. You're a human bomb, guided by flesh and blood toward a target that may or may not matter to the war's outcome. Below you, American sailors scramble to their battle stations, unaware that the greatest horror of the Pacific War isn't the kamikaze attack itself. It's what drove ordinary young men to volunteer for certain death. By October 1944, the Japanese Empire is dying. American forces have island-hopped across the Pacific, bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. The Philippines, Japan's last major stronghold, hangs by a thread. The combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, has been systematically destroyed in battles like Midway and the Philippine Sea. Conventional tactics have failed completely. Japanese pilots, once among the world's best, are now mostly inexperienced teenagers with minimal training. Fuel shortages ground aircraft. Experienced instructors are dead or flying missions with green recruits who barely know how to land, let alone fight American aces. Into this desperate situation steps Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi with a proposal that shocks even hardened military leaders: organized suicide attacks using aircraft as guided missiles. The plan isn't born from Bushido tradition or samurai honor. It's cold mathematics applied to hopeless circumstances. The numbers are brutal and undeniable. A conventional bombing attack might have a 10% chance of hitting an enemy ship. The pilot might survive to fly again. A kamikaze attack has nearly a 100% chance of at least damaging the target. The pilot will certainly die, but his death might sink a destroyer, cripple a carrier, or delay an invasion fleet long enough for Japan to negotiate better surrender terms. Onishi calls his suicide squadrons Shimpu, meaning divine wind, referencing the typhoons that saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries earlier. American translators mispronounce it as kamikaze, and the name sticks. What begins as a desperate improvisation at Leyte Gulf quickly becomes institutionalized madness affecting the entire Japanese military. The kamikaze program expands with terrifying efficiency. Special attack units form throughout Japan's remaining air bases. Training schools teach young pilots not aerial combat, but how to fly just well enough to reach enemy ships. Aircraft factories modify planes specifically for suicide missions, removing unnecessary equipment and adding extra explosives. The cultural machinery of Japanese society mobilizes to support this death cult. Shinto priests bless kamikaze pilots as living gods. Schools teach children that dying for the emperor represents the highest human achievement. Propaganda presents suicide attacks as proof of Japanese spiritual superiority over materialistic Americans. But beneath the ceremonial facade and patriotic rhetoric lies a more disturbing truth. Many kamikaze pilots are coerced, drugged, or simply too young to understand what they're volunteering for. The divine wind becomes a hurricane of organized suicide that consumes Japan's youth in a final, desperate gamble against inevitable defeat. Life as a kamikaze pilot begins with a lie. You're told you're volunteering for special attack missions that will turn the tide of war. The reality becomes clear only after you've committed. This is a one-way ticket to death with no possibility of return. The selection process targets the most vulnerable candidates. University students face conscription and certain death in infantry units, or they can volunteer for the Special Attack Corps with promises of honor and quick promotion to officer rank. Rural teenagers, raised on emperor worship and Bushido mythology, eagerly embrace what they believe is glorious sacrifice. Others simply have no choice. Refusing means court-martial and execution for cowardice. Training facilities become factories for manufacturing suicide. At bases like Chiron and Kanoya, instructors teach just enough flying skills to reach enemy ships. Navigation, combat maneuvering, and landing procedures are considered unnecessary. Why waste time teaching dead men skills they'll never use? Some pilots receive fewer than 40 hours of flight training before their final mission. The psychological conditioning proves more elaborate than the flight instruction. Daily ceremonies reinforce the religious nature of kamikaze attacks. Pilots write death poems in classical Japanese style, compose final letters home, and participate in ritual purification ceremonies that blur the line between military service and religious suicide. Living quarters reflect the morbid nature of your assignment. Personal belongings are collected and stored for shipment home after your death. Rooms are Spartan, temporary. Why provide comfort for men who won't be alive next week? Meals improve dramatically before missions, as if a good final dinner somehow compensates for state-sponsored murder. The drugs begin appearing regularly in your rice and tea. Methamphetamine, called Hirapon in Japan, keeps pilots alert during long flights and suppresses natural survival instincts. Alcohol flows freely during pre-mission ceremonies, lowering inhibitions and numbing the terror of impending death. Some pilots are so intoxicated they can barely walk to their aircraft. Peer pressure becomes a weapon more powerful than any court-martial. In group settings, refusing kamikaze duty means public humiliation and ostracism. The social dynamics of Japanese culture make individual resistance nearly impossible. When your friends volunteer for death, refusing makes you a coward in a society where personal honor matters more than personal survival. The countdown to death follows a rigid schedule. Mission briefings detail target locations, approach routes, and optimal impact points on enemy ships. Pilots receive photographs of their targets and study ship silhouettes like hunters examining prey. Mechanics modify aircraft for maximum destructive effect, removing armor, adding explosives, ensuring nothing survives impact. Final preparations take on religious significance. Pilots bathe ritually, don clean uniforms, and participate in ceremonies that treat living men as already dead. Sake toasts celebrate impending martyrdom. Commanders deliver speeches about emperor worship and Japanese destiny that transform murder into mythology. The most disturbing aspect isn't the death itself. It's how systematically Japanese society convinces young men that suicide represents their highest achievement. The kamikaze program doesn't just kill pilots, it corrupts an entire culture into celebrating death over life, defeat over victory, and fanaticism over reason. The greatest enemy of a kamikaze pilot isn't American fighters or anti-aircraft guns. It's the war between your survival instincts and the psychological machinery designed to override them. Every day brings new forms of mental torture designed to make death seem preferable to life. Family pressure arrives in carefully orchestrated waves. Letters from home don't offer comfort. They demand sacrifice. Mothers write about the honor of having a son die for the emperor. Fathers express pride that their bloodline will contribute to Japan's divine mission. Siblings describe their shame at not being old enough to volunteer for suicide missions themselves. These aren't spontaneous expressions of patriotism. They're coached responses that weaponize family bonds against individual survival. The military's psychological manipulation follows scientific precision. Commanders rotate between promises of glory and threats of disgrace. One day, you're told that kamikaze pilots become gods after death, worshipped at Yasukuni Shrine forever. The next day, you hear whispered stories about pilots who refused missions being beaten, imprisoned, or executed as traitors. The message becomes clear. Death brings honor, but backing out brings something worse than death. Drug dependency develops with terrifying speed. What begins as occasional methamphetamine to calm pre-mission nerves becomes daily addiction to function at all. Pilots need drugs to sleep, to eat, to attend briefings without breaking down completely. The military controls the supply, ensuring that withdrawal symptoms coincide with mission assignments. Choose suicide or face the agony of forced detox in military prison. Perhaps most cruel is the treatment of pilots who survive failed missions. Mechanical failures, weather delays, or inability to locate targets sometimes bring kamikaze pilots back to base alive. Rather than relief, They face intense shame and suspicion. Other pilots question their commitment. Commanders doubt their resolve. Families receive word that their son failed in his sacred duty. These survivors often volunteer for immediate second missions, preferring death to continued humiliation. The psychological toll manifests in ways that shock even military psychiatrists. Some pilots develop complete emotional numbness, going through daily routines like robots programmed for death. Others suffer violent mood swings, oscillating between manic enthusiasm and suicidal depression, though in their case, suicidal depression represents the desired outcome. Religious indoctrination creates its own category of mental torture. Shinto priests teach that individual life has no value compared to serving the emperor, who represents divine will on earth. Buddhist concepts of reincarnation get twisted to suggest that kamikaze pilots will be reborn as gods. These aren't traditional Japanese religious teachings. They're corrupted versions designed specifically to make suicide seem spiritually necessary. The peer pressure operates through carefully constructed social dynamics. Pilots live in small groups where refusal to volunteer for missions means complete ostracism. Meals become silent. Conversations stop when you enter rooms. Other pilots treat you as already dead, but in a shameful way rather than an honorable one. The isolation proves more unbearable than the prospect of death. Age becomes a weapon against psychological resistance. Many kamikaze pilots are teenagers whose brains haven't fully developed capacity for long-term consequences. They understand death intellectually, but can't grasp its permanent finality. Military recruiters exploit this developmental limitation, presenting suicide missions as exciting adventures rather than irreversible endings. Some pilots develop what psychologists would later recognize as Stockholm Syndrome toward their captors. They begin genuinely believing that the military leaders ordering their deaths actually care about their welfare. The psychological manipulation becomes so complete that victims defend their abusers and volunteer for missions out of gratitude rather than coercion. The most insidious pressure comes from the redefinition of normalcy. When suicide missions become routine, refusing to die begins to seem abnormal. The baseline shifts until volunteering for death represents standard behavior, while wanting to live appears selfish and unpatriotic. Reality inverts completely. Sanity becomes madness, and madness becomes duty. Physical exhaustion compounds psychological vulnerability. Pilots work 18-hour days between training, ceremonies, and mission preparation. Chronic sleep deprivation makes rational thinking nearly impossible. Malnutrition, even officers face food shortages by 1945, weakens mental resistance along with physical strength. Perhaps cruelest of all is the false hope deliberately cultivated and then destroyed. Pilots are told their sacrifices will save Japan, turn the tide of war, and protect their families from American invasion. When reality intrudes, when kamikaze attacks clearly aren't changing the war's outcome, commanders simply increase the pressure rather than acknowledge the futility. The cumulative effect creates a psychological hell more devastating than any physical torture. Pilots face the choice between certain death with honor or probable death with shame, all while being systematically stripped of the mental tools needed to make rational decisions about their own survival. April 6, 1945. Operation Kikusui begins. You are 19-year-old Flight Petty Officer Setsuo Ishino, standing on the runway at Kanoya Air Base as part of the largest kamikaze attack in history. 355 suicide planes prepare to launch against the American fleet off Okinawa. This is Japan's last desperate gamble. Throw everything at the Americans in a massive wave that will either save the homeland or consume what remains of Japanese aviation. The ceremony begins at dawn. White headbands painted with rising suns. Cups of sake passed among pilots who barely look old enough to shave. Your commanding officer, Captain Okamura, delivers a speech about emperor worship and divine destiny, but his voice cracks with emotion. Even he knows this is organized murder disguised as military strategy. Your aircraft, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, carries a 500-pound bomb welded to its belly. The release mechanism has been removed. There's no way to drop the bomb and return home. The fuel tank contains just enough gasoline for a one-way trip to the American fleet. Every modification screams the same message. This plane is designed to die. The takeoff sequence unfolds like a funeral procession. Aircraft lift off in groups of 10, forming up over the base before heading south toward Okinawa. Below, ground crews wave white flags and shout "Banzai," a final farewell to men they'll never see again. Some pilots waggle their wings in response. Others stare straight ahead, faces frozen in expressions of terror or resignation. The flight toward target takes 2 hours. 2 hours to contemplate your approaching death while flying over the blue Pacific that will soon become your grave. The radio crackles with final messages from pilots who spot American ships on the horizon. "I see the enemy fleet. Beginning attack run. Long live the Emperor." Then silence as each transmission ends forever. As you approach Okinawa, the scope of American naval power becomes terrifyingly clear. Hundreds of ships stretch to the horizon. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, and transports forming the largest fleet ever assembled. Their anti-aircraft guns create a wall of exploding steel that turns the sky black with flak bursts. The first wave of kamikaze attacks begins like a choreographed dance of death. Planes dive from different altitudes and directions, trying to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. Some aircraft explode in midair, torn apart by flak before reaching their targets. Others slam into destroyer escorts and cruisers in eruptions of flame and smoke. Your turn comes as you spot a destroyer conducting screening operations away from the main fleet. The ship's outline matches the silhouettes you memorized during briefings. This is USS Laffey, your assigned target and final destination. The dive begins. Your aircraft screams downward at terminal velocity, while American gunners track your approach with desperate precision. Tracer rounds streak past your cockpit like deadly fireworks. The destroyer's 5-inch guns boom constantly, filling the air around your plane with explosive death. At 2,000 feet, something snaps inside your mind. The survival instinct that military training tried to suppress suddenly reasserts itself with overwhelming force. You don't want to die. You don't want to slam into that ship and disappear in a ball of flame. You want to go home, see your family, live the life that propaganda convinced you to throw away. But it's too late. The aircraft is diving too fast to pull out. The controls no longer respond to your desperate attempts to change course. Physics and aerodynamics combine to ensure that your moment of clarity comes exactly when it can no longer matter. The last thing you see is the destroyer's deck rushing toward you at 300 miles per hour. USS Laffey survives your attack and 4 others, earning the nickname the ship that would not die. Your sacrifice and the deaths of 354 other kamikaze pilots that day accomplish nothing except adding more names to casualty lists. The American fleet continues its bombardment of Okinawa. The invasion proceeds on schedule. Japan moves one step closer to inevitable defeat. Operation Kikusui demonstrates the ultimate futility of the kamikaze program. Despite throwing away hundreds of young lives in a single day, Japanese forces fail to sink a single major American warship. The divine wind becomes a hurricane of pointless death that consumes Japan's youth without changing the war's outcome by even a single day. The numbers tell a story of systematic waste that defies military logic. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in suicide attacks. They damaged or sank 368 Allied ships, but only 34 of these were major vessels. The exchange rate, 100 dead pilots for every significant ship sunk, represents one of the most inefficient military strategies in human history. More devastating than the tactical failure is the human cost measured in destroyed families and shattered communities. Entire university classes simply vanish, their potential contributions to post-war Japan lost forever. Rural villages lose entire generations of young men to a program that accomplishes nothing except adding names to casualty lists. The psychological damage to survivors proves as devastating as the physical casualties. Kamikaze pilots who lived through failed missions carry crushing guilt for decades. Many suffer what would later be recognized as severe PTSD, but 1940s. Japan has no framework for understanding or treating trauma from state-sponsored suicide programs. I was supposed to die for the Emperor. But I lived while my friends burned, wrote former Kamikaze pilot Takeshi Maeda in 1965. Every day I wake up feeling like a coward, even though I know the whole program was insane. They stole our youth and gave us nothing but shame in return. Post-war investigations reveal the true scope of coercion within the Kamikaze program. Military tribunals document cases of pilots being physically beaten for refusing missions, families threatened with imprisonment, and widespread use of drugs to overcome natural survival instincts. What propaganda presented as voluntary sacrifice proves to be systematic murder disguised as military strategy. The international community reacts with horror to revelations about organized suicide attacks. The Geneva Conventions are strengthened to explicitly prohibit forcing military personnel to undertake missions with no possibility of survival. The Kamikaze program becomes a case study in how military organizations can corrupt cultural values to justify the unjustifiable. Japanese society struggles with the moral reckoning for decades. Some veterans groups continue to glorify kamikaze pilots as heroes who embodied ultimate sacrifice. Others recognize them as victims of a system that exploited cultural values to manufacture consent for mass suicide. The debate reflects deeper questions about individual responsibility versus systemic coercion. The technological legacy proves equally complex. While kamikaze attacks advance understanding of guided weapons and precision strikes, they also demonstrate the fundamental inefficiency of human-guided munitions compared to conventional ordnance. Modern military forces develop sophisticated missiles that achieve kamikaze accuracy without requiring human sacrifice. Perhaps most importantly, the kamikaze program serves as a warning about how quickly civilized societies can descend into barbarism when survival is at stake. The systematic corruption of religious teachings, family relationships, and educational institutions shows how totalitarian regimes exploit cultural values to achieve military objectives. The ultimate tragedy isn't just the 3,800 young men who died in kamikaze attacks. It's the corruption of an entire society that convinced itself that suicide represented the highest form of patriotism. The Divine Wind becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when military desperation overrides basic human decency. Today, former kamikaze bases serve as peace museums, their runways silent reminders of the price paid when nations choose fanaticism over reason, death over life, and propaganda over truth. The next time someone tells you that young people today lack dedication or sacrifice, remember the kamikaze pilots. They gave everything their country asked for, and their country asked for everything, including their lives, their sanity, and their humanity. These weren't heroes or villains. They were teenagers manipulated by a system that weaponized honor, family loyalty, and religious belief to manufacture consent for mass suicide. They died not for glory or victory, but because a desperate regime convinced them that death served a higher purpose than life. In small shrines across Japan, their photographs still receive offerings from elderly relatives who never fully understood what happened to their sons, brothers, and fathers. Young faces frozen in time, wearing uniforms they believed would carry them to glory, but delivered only meaningless death. The real horror of the kamikaze program isn't that it happened, it's how easily it could happen again. Any society that teaches its young to value ideology over individual life, duty over personal choice, and death over survival carries the seeds of its own monstrous transformation. Remember them not as divine wind, but as a warning whispered on the breeze. Question everything, especially those who demand your life for their cause.